So my presentation is on building a self-hosted music tracker. It's on my website. It's just 4ad.dev/music. Um, and so I guess just to get into why I built this, I get to own the data. I get to mess with my own metadata. So I have all of my music hosted on Plex, which I'm too lazy to administer myself. So I pay a company to run the server for me, and you can just mount Google Drive to it. So all of the music I listen to, I just copy and paste into a Google Drive directory, and off I go. So I get to stream my own music. It's not all on like my own hardware, my own storage, and Last.fm is around, but it's run by, I think Paramount owns it now, which was bought by Larry Ellison, and God knows what's going to happen to it. They'll probably remember they own it and unplug it. Um, and so to handle data collection, whenever I listen to something in Plex, they have webhooks. Once I just paid for like the lifetime Plex Pro. And I've experimented with other stuff too, like Jellyfin, to just have backup options should anything happen to Plex. But Plex has proven to be the most convenient because they will send like their own Scrabble event, which is like a just an indication that something has been played, which sort of takes away all the complexity of me trying to discern when something hasn't like has been played, and making sure I don't duplicate tracks. That goes ahead and hits a Cloudflare worker, which checks for my Plex account ID so nobody else can submit listens, and then writes a listen to Supabase, which is I pay for the tier just so I don't have to worry about it, but it's basically a fancy SaaS wrapper around Postgres. So you get them to take care of it. You get things like database triggers and functions and stuff like that. And so we get into sort of my data structure for this. When I started out, I was writing everything to Netlify's JSON blob storage, which was just horrific, but I'm primarily a front-end developer. And so I thought, hey, JSON, cool, I'll read the object, update the object, and write it. And that'll be it. Actually worked surprisingly well for something that ill-conceived, but ended up going with the database. It was a bit of a fight to figure it out. And Plex doesn't really send a ton of metadata out with the webhook, but they do send like artist name, track name, album name. And so I basically came up with this scheme where I turn the artist name and the album into a unique key. So it'll just be normalized to all lowercase, dash delimited, and that'll be the key that connects the listens table to the to the albums table. The albums table is connected to the artist table, and listens are also connected to artists, so it has to be an exact match between like the artist name and what I have stored in the database, which is typically fine because it's all stuff I control. Um, and so I guess getting into that, because I have to add everything I listen to up front for it to be tracked. I also have logic in the Cloudflare worker so that if it hits on it or if it misses a match, it'll insert a tentative record for me with placeholder art and then send me an email saying like, hey, I created this placeholder for you. Um, and then, from there, I allow the front end in 11D obviously to be rebuilt every hour, which is going to be the landing page primarily at this point. Um, and then I use Directus, which I'll get into a little bit later, but it's sort of a CMS. It's just this really, I think I tried a few different platforms, but it's this really like flexible backend that sits on top of Postgres. And so you can add the existing collections to it and define fields, whatever you want to do with it. Um, it's actually really nice. I just upgraded the box I was running it on because I had the cheapest possible instance over at DigitalOcean. Um, and it's in a Docker file, so all I have to do is commit like version bumps to it and it updates itself. Um, and so it has an API. I don't use the API. I use Supabase's JavaScript SDK to go ahead and query that. Part of that was I didn't even have Directive set up at first. I got used to Supabase's SDK, and it just returns a JSON object when you run it inside of a data file. So it's not 11D fetch or anything like that, but you do just get JSON out of it. Um, And so yeah, so I started writing listening data to Netlify. I added Supabase on top of that. At first I was like, I'll just Postgres is it's a table. I'll treat it like a spreadsheet and I'll update it manually, which was also a terrible idea. But again, I do front end work, so I'm just sort of like working my way into this like backwards and learning stuff as I go, which is I mean, being a self-taught developer, it's what I've always done. So I just keep breaking stuff until it works. And so, when I build all this out, every time 11D rebuilds or Cloudflare rebuilds the site, it's just a super simple worker that runs on cron. I'll get this like updated intro to the music page, which is, hey, I've listened to these artists, I've listened to these albums. I want to say I just recently built this into the actual like optimized view from Directus. Before I was using a filter to sort of parse out the genres in order. But now that's just part of the query that I get back. And the line with the emoji is another edge function that pulls the most recent track on each reload. That's just a web component. All it does is it has an attribute that takes the URL for the API that returns HTML and reloads. Like on refresh, it'll drop it into like the track into session storage, so it's cached. And I just updated it too, so that when 11 builds, it does like a static render of that last most previously generated track too. So if JavaScript isn't enabled, it'll just show, I guess, what was on top for the last hour. Um, and then I get artist grids. Everything is again, I when I was doing this, I was like, I'll just do a key match to Bunny CDN. I'm not going to use Directus's image functionality because why would I do things the easy way? And so that was matched along the same lines as the keys, but I went ahead and refactored that so that I am using Directus's image uploading, which is super convenient. It goes to a B2 bucket, which sits behind Bunny. That's all connected, and Directus stores the ID of the image in Supabase, so I can just query that field and just get the raw JPEG each time. It's sort of the same deal for the albums, it'll just be updated each time. I went through and refactored the views recently so that all of the data is sent in the shape I want it from Directus. So there's just going to be like every time you get a query from music, there's going to be a grid property in the JSON. All of the paths are the same. So all of these views for like media grids are used across my site. And then we get into genre pages. I went through a while back and connected all of the different collections too. So if I read a book about a genre of music, if I watch a documentary, I can go ahead and connect those and it'll render on the genre page. And much like the artist page, or I guess the core music page, instead of showing top genres, it's going to show the top artists from the genre that I've listened to. Um, and then this was sort of another recent change. So for the longest time, I was basically rendering every single artist page, every single like book page, show page that I had entries for up front, which is, as you can imagine, kind of slow since it's about 3,300 pages that get rendered on each build. Ends up being a terrible idea. And so I refactored these so that they are all in yet another Cloudflare worker. Um, and so that's basically, I wrote up a blog post about it, but the way this works is essentially that the worker controls a few different routes. So like slash books, slash watching, slash music, slash artists, that kind of thing. And on each request, it queries like my global metadata table. It queries the table for the appropriate path. And so if it's an artist, it'll query the artist table and get a slug that's in Directus. If it hits a match, it'll pull basically all the right artist data and render the page. And it does that by, I added some data attributes to like the core metadata in my base template. I added one to like the content wrapper, and the worker will go ahead and uses a DOM parser library to basically parse the HTML. It'll replace all the metadata from my base template and it'll replace the core content. So there's a bunch of helpers that will generate each sort of like media type, which is basically HTML and templates with tokens attached. So you get it basically gets you away from pre-generating all those pages. They're relatively low traffic and you lose a little bit in performance, but it caches it after the first load. And so it's kind of nice. And as mentioned, you can just add an artist, hit a button and direct us and go ahead and see the page that came out of that. And this is sort of what the whole thing looks like on the admin. So I have a globals collection, which is all of my site metadata, all of my pages, navigation, robots, and everything is managed through there. So you can go in, add an artist, have to add all of their albums for them to be recognized whenever I play anything out of Plex. Images, bios. I bootstrapped the bios by basic. I'm not sure entirely where Plex gets them. It seems to be a combination of AllMusic and Last.fm. And they have a private API for their web player. So I basically just looked at the network traffic, wrote up a bad node script, and scraped all of those bios and wrote them into Directus and then updated them. They don't have a proper API, but I don't know. Web traffic is web traffic. I have all the artist metadata. If I add emoji for an artist that shows up by now playing, if I have a tattoo inspired by an artist, there's an indicator for that and it shows up on the artist page. And that tentative Boolean value is essentially for when the tracking function adds an artist, if I shouldn't, like, if I should happen to not have a record for them, that'll be marked as true. So I can filter for that in Directus and sort of quickly find anything I need. And then fields like MBID is a Music Brains ID, which is sort of like Wikipedia for album releases. And that is actually hooked up to their API, so I can just query that inline. Oh, all right. And yeah, again, so if I miss a record, I'll go ahead and update those. I have a Directus flow, which is sort of, it's basically an automation you can trigger it based on like creating a record, updating a record. And I have this big long one that's chained together. So at the bottom of each album record, there's this collapsed field. And if I have created a new album record, I'll go grab the key for the old one, paste it into that field and hit save. And the flow basically copies everything from the old record into the new one and deletes it instead of me having to copy and paste like 6 fields over manually. Um, and so I guess next is more stability, but it's actually proven to work pretty well. So it's a lot of just I don't know. It took a while to get it running. It's a lot of errors, a lot of mistakes, but I can go through like there's the listens view inside of Directus. I can sit there and watch it just insert. And all of those fields are just set to read only because I'm not going to manually edit them. Um, Ideally, I'd like to have workflows to make managing data simpler too, but I think like looking at something like Last.fm, a lot of their metadata is community provided. And you'll see a lot of the same stuff too, where it just creates like empty records if somebody listens to something that isn't marked up properly. So I think maybe they're handling that more gracefully, but it's sort of, I think, a similar kind of model, but the community on this is just me. So it falls on me to maintain it. And then I've had a few folks express interest in something like this too. So I don't know if it's something I could ever slap into like a Docker container over the long term and probably build more adapters so that you could actually play more stuff through it too. But I think like even with something like Music Brains, they have a similar service called Listen Brains too, but adoption is like so hard because there's so many music players and not all of them are that configurable. So I think Last of them is has won out because it's been around the longest, but I can't really speak to how long that'll remain the case. Um, yeah, that's sort of where it sits for now. And yeah, happy to answer any questions, but it's been a lot of, I don't know, I think one of the other more tedious parts too is I did go through and like format all of the artist bios, which is I realized pretty ridiculous for about 615 artists, but here I am.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cory.
Yeah.
Anyone have questions? Bob says, wow. And there's some claps in the chat. Yeah, that was a lot. Do you have any source code that's available? Like, I know your front end
It's
is probably on GitHub. I don't know. Yeah.
it's all on GitHub. I actually added the views recently, which is let's see if I can change uh, change what I'm sharing. All right. So I can go over and say, I want to see. Just have Chrome open to present, but it's all gonna be off in here. So the actual worker is okay, this fella. So basically helpers to clean up the media string, logic to send emails to myself. I had to add some retries to the email logic just because it would fail to send at times. And then worker itself basically just takes in data, sends the email, parses all of the, I guess, limited metadata that comes in, and then some logic for placeholders. It's actually surprisingly, I don't know, it's kind of verbose, but it's relatively simple. And all of the queries for all of the music stuff are in here too. So it's a bunch of just Postgres statements, which is a lot of the mess is from like related media content. So there's joins to all the other tables and stuff like that. I want to say that I actually have it pulled up to where, let's see if I can share this as well. And so when you actually go in and look at it, you can see all of the artists that have sort of flowed in. You can go look at the listens table, which is, everything I've listened to recently. There's 21,812 records. And so you can go all the way back to the beginning and, just page through them. And then the actual flow to correct records is this big old mess too. So if I update a record, grabs checks to see if there's an old key for the record, fetches the old one, it actually fetched it. It updates the album data, fetches the new record, updates the listens, updates the listen totals. So those are RPC calls over to Supabase, deletes the old record, and sends myself a notification. So it's, it's like a bit of a contraption. There's artists here, there's concerts I've been to. Venues for the concerts, anything that needs to be formatted is going to be there. To cures any albums that need to be cleaned up, like you'd cure a ballad, I guess. And then album or all the albums are here, so it's going to be like total plays descending. And then I have a setup for upcoming albums too, so there will be, you know, if you go into if you go into these guys, you'll get like the album art, you'll have like a release date or release link, and I also since I neglect to actually check this view myself, it I set up a collection too that spits out an ICS file so I can subscribe to the calendar. Um, and those will show up when albums actually come out. Um, yeah, and so it all sits in here. I mean, there's other sections too, like movies, shows, books, everything I'm reading. The contact form gets dumped into here too, and it'll also send me an email, but it gets written to the database. So I don't know, it's become, it was something where I built it out. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do the music stuff. And I was like, okay, this is pretty convenient. I'll put books in here, and then it's like, oh, I might as well put shows, and then might as well put movies. And then it was like, okay, I'll just put
Just
posts in
keep
here.
going.
Yeah, I just kept going, and I was like, okay, no, I should get the pages in here, and I should get links in here and navigation. So like all the pages are in here, and they have permalinks and I went through and added artist slugs too, so everyone has a slug. So if I want to go see the page, I can just view the artist. Um, since it's dynamic, it'll just open right up. And you can edit albums right in line. If I paste the old key in there, it gets updated. Total plays will be down here, and then I have database triggers over at Supabase too. So like whenever a listen gets inserted, it'll increment total plays for like albums, artists, genres, so it doesn't have to recalculate it based off the listens table. And then there's a function that runs every night at midnight, and basically it's just update everything to make sure it's in sync. But you sort of, you can go in here. I added a button to run the same RPC call. So if I click that, it'll run the same function and update everything to make sure it's in sync. So it's, I think, yeah, it started out as like JSON over at Netlify to let's build a database to let's try and make just sort of like raw database connections work to let's have Directus do it and actually do it the right way. Because when I pulled the collections into Directus, they didn't they didn't really look right. Um, and it ended up being weird relationships too, but it's a pretty friendly sort of tool to actually configure things. You can just create a field, and it gives you all this stuff to basically add to it, so then it became like, hey, I'll pull in posts too, and then, I can create blocks that get associated at the end of a post. Whenever I post something, I have yet another Cloudflare worker that checks an RSS feed, posts it to Mastodon, and then matches the slug that was posted to Mastodon to my posts table and adds the Mastodon URL. And then we'll show the Mastodon URL at the end of the post. Um, so, I don't know. It's a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine, but it's kind of just a mostly custom. I don't know. Or Directus enabled a lot of it, but it's a pretty custom sort of headless CMS kind of look to it. And you can add stuff to the sidebar, like this will rebuild it. And
Rube would be proud.
so
Awesome.
I,
Well, thank you so much,
yeah.
Cory.